Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran with episode 118 of season 3. This is part 1 of the road to Seringapatam. In the last episode, Bangalore was licking its wounds, reassembling itself in the weeks after the city fell to the invading British. The dead were buried and the Pete reopened for business. As the war continued, though, the British coalition against Mysore started to gather momentum. The forces of the Nizam of Hyderabad, walking in step with the British, were taking position. The garrison was set. And this episode carries that story forward. The pause is over and the march on the capital of Mysore, Srirangapatna, begins. But before we march anywhere, first as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their generosity in their corporate support. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Bangalore had fallen. That much was settled. But the ultimate prize for the British was the entire kingdom of Mysore, and that was yet to be taken. Srirangapatna, the island fortress in the Kaveri and the seat of Tipu Sultan's court, was still standing. Tipu had not surrendered. His army had been shaken by the loss of Bangalore, but far from broken, and it still numbered in the tens of thousands of troops and very astute and battle-blooded generals. So yes, while the fall of Bangalore had been a serious blow, it had not been a knockout. Charles Cornwallis, Governor-General of India and the commander of the British forces against Tipu Sultan, understood that anything short of forcing Tipu to terms at his own capital would leave the campaign against Mysore half finished. For these reasons, while the victory over Bangalore was no small achievement, not to take all of Mysore would be merely to have won a battle and conceded the war against Britain's most formidable enemy to date. There was, inside the captured Bangalore Fort itself, a clue as to how serious an adversary Tipu remained. While British engineers took stock of the ammunition stores, they found them to be extraordinarily well provisioned. 120 cannons of Spanish, French and British manufacture, of which 85 was still fit for use. There was enough dry ammunition in the magazines in the arsenal to withstand a siege lasting a full year. Bangalore had been built out to hold indefinitely. In the present case, it had held out for 17 days. Now that gap between what the fort was equipped to survive and what it had actually survived had told Cornwallis something very important. He was not fighting a state that was short on resources. He was fighting a state that had run out of time, but merely in one city and on one particular night. These things happen in battle. Elsewhere in Srirangapatna, for example, resources were very much intact. If Bangalore, a secondary fortress, could be stocked for a year's siege, what might Cornwallis expect to find waiting for him at the capital itself? So on the one hand, there was a concern about how difficult it would be to take Srirangapatna. But on the other hand was another concern. There was the rainy season that was approaching. The southwest monsoon and the pre-monsoon showers typically broke across the Mysore plateau in June, and once it did, a military campaign of this magnitude would become close to impossible. Rivers rising, roads simply dissolving, and armies not being able to move an inch. Cornwallis had set his sights on concluding the entire campaign, the march on Srirangapatna included, before the rains arrived. Bangalore had fallen in late March. Cornwallis had at best 2 months to force the result in Srirangapatna. This was too little time to defeat the strongest ruler in southern India, indeed, one of the strongest rulers in India. And then layered on top of that seasonal clock was another larger clock. Back in Europe, Britain and France had only recently stepped back from open war. The Treaty of Versailles in 1783, the same settlement that had confirmed American independence, had also confirmed French possession of Pondicherry on the Indian coast, with the understanding that the French would keep its military presence in Pondicherry limited. Now, this was an uneasy peace, and everyone in the British camp knew it. By 1791, the British government in London was watching events unfold in France with some alarm. The French Revolution, which had begun 2 years earlier as a constitutional crisis, was now turning radical, and the diplomatic temperature between Paris and London was rising by the month. There were the early unmistakable signals that France and Britain would soon be at war again. And if that happened, every soldier, every ship, and every pound, shilling, and pence committed to a campaign in India would be a soldier, a ship, and a shilling unavailable for the war that mattered more to London, the one across the Channel. Meanwhile, the East India Company Board of Directors were pressing Cornwallis on this point. They were exhorting him to bring the war with Tipu to a close. Do it quickly, reach an accommodation if need be. If a decisive victory was slow in coming, don't bother trying for one. Britain could not afford a long grinding campaign on the Mysore plateau while bracing for a European war. The company's board of directors might have had another agenda. The war against Tipu was not great for their share valuation, for their share prices. Now, already in 1786, the company's stock had taken a beating. It had fallen from £275 to £220 in a single trading session when news of Hyder Ali's victory in Madras had reached the London Stock Exchange. So now, all in all, Cornwallis was not only marching on a fortress against a monsoon deadline, he was marching on a fortress against a monsoon deadline with a second larger clock running in London that he could not see, he could not control, much less stop. And each week that the war dragged on in Mysore was a week of risk accumulating 6,000 miles away in a chancery that Cornwallis would never visit over a war that he was not fighting. But not wanting to make peace with Tipu Sultan, he decided that he would move quickly and decisively in hostile country against an enemy who knew the ground far better than he did. And the campaign was afoot. When I said knew the ground far better than he did, I was meaning this literally. On the one hand, there was the route to Srirangapatna from Bangalore. Cornwallis was finely tuned to war strategies, and logistics appears to have been one of his stronger points. Tipu, who was also a proven military strategist himself, might not have known exactly what Cornwallis would do in terms of the route, but he could assess which road the British would more naturally take. This would be the direct route, running west out of Bangalore towards the south through Closepet, which we now know as Ramnagara, and that would be the shortest line from Bengaluru to Srirangapatna. So Tipu naturally positioned troops along this corridor, and then his cavalry was kept at the ready to harass the columns, cut off the foraging parties, bleed the march slow and expensive mile by mile. Cornwallis was wise to the Mysore game. He had spent the first year of this war watching a British strategy fail for exactly this reason. His predecessor in command, General William Meadows, had split his forces into 3 separate columns advancing on different lines, and this was a strategy that had handed Tipu an advantage of interior lines, letting him concentrate his own forces against each isolated British column in turn. It worked exactly the opposite of what the British wanted. Cornwallis had no intention of repeating that mistake, and he had even less intention of marching straight into a road that Tipu had prepared for his arrival. So instead, he chose the longer and the more circuitous route. This was the road that went through Kanakahalli, angling away from the obvious line of advance. Now, you might remember from earlier episodes that Cornwallis had done exactly that when he was approaching Bangalore, climbing the plateau from the British Hill Baramahal area. He had taken the Mugli Pass unexpectedly and managed to arrive on the Mysore plateau without having fired a shot. But now taking the Kanakahalli route would cost him time he could not really spare, given this 2 o'clock thing that was running against him. At the same time, it would also cost Tipu time for preparation, forcing him to abandon all those carefully chosen defensive positions and now scrambled to reposition his forces along a route that he had not anticipated. And then it's funny how events across the world become connected through cause and consequence. And what I'm talking about is something else in Cornwallis's caution, something way more personal. A decade earlier in Virginia in the United States, Cornwallis had commanded a British army that found itself trapped, pinned at the town of Yorktown, encircled by land and sea with no route left open. That defeat ended in surrender, and it influenced the rest of his career. Cornwallis had not forgotten what it felt like to be caught in a position with no way out. He would not walk into a prepared trap again, not in Virginia, certainly not in Mysore, and whatever it cost him in time, he did not have. So, taking stock of the moment, the stage then was set. Srirangapatna stood awaiting the British onslaught. The enemy within, Tipu Sultan, dangerous. Despite the deadlines of London and the southwest monsoon lining up against Cornwallis, here he was, choosing the long route to Srirangapatna. What all this preparation sought to counter was the weapon that Tipu had used before to devastating effect and was about to use again. Not his army, not the rockets, but the terrain of the Mysore plateau itself. And now for a commercial break, and when I come back, would Cornwallis find out about the Mysore terrain the hard way? In only 30 seconds, right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
The march of the British to Srirangapatna was everything that Tipu had intended it to be: slow, exhausting, and grinding. Tipu had ordered all the villages along the line of Cornwallis's march to be emptied, grain stores stripped, water wells fouled or sealed and abandoned, village livestock driven off or slaughtered rather than left for the enemy. This was Mysore's famous scorched-earth tactic. Tipu's father Hyder Ali had used the same strategy to devastating effect in the First Anglo-Mysore War. Decades earlier, you might remember from an earlier episode how I talked about the letter that he had written to the British commander of the day, Colonel Wood. Now, Colonel Wood had written him a letter, taunting him, telling him to abandon his guerrilla tactics and instead arrive with his army on the plateau and fight the British forces head on head. But what Hyder Ali replied was that Colonel Wood had no right to tell him what he would do and how he would conduct his war, and then went on to promise that the British would not find so much as a blade of grass or a drop of water anywhere they marched, and then that their limbs would swell to the size of their bodies. That was prophetic, and it was true. Tipu was his father's son in this respect, if no other. Now the British column was advancing through a landscape that had been methodically stripped of everything that an army needs to survive, and every foraging party that ventured out to find supplies risked being cut down by Tipu's light cavalry, also called the Lutis, which moved through this scorched country faster than the British ever could. As the campaign inched forward, the bullocks were the first to break. Now let's find out how important were these bullocks. The entire logistical spine of an 18th century Indian campaign ran on bullock trains. Vast columns of these draft animals hauling the heavy siege guns, the cannons without which no stone fortress could ever be reduced. Now on the road to Srirangapatna, the fodder ran out, the animals weakened, and thousands of bullocks collapsed along the route, unable to live. As the bullocks fell, the cannons had to stop moving with them. But the British would not give up. Soldiers were harnessed to ropes in the place of the bullocks and made to drag the heavy ordnance, the cannon, across broken ground by hand. Progress, which had already been slow, became something close to agony right now, with men doing the work of oxen, one exhausted step at a time. under a harsh sun that gave no quarter 1 minute, and then without warning, long, heavy rain that gave none either. This was not a campaign being fought against Mysore alone. It was being fought against the land and the weather. And as we all know, no one wins against nature. Conditions in the British camp deteriorated in step. Contemporary accounts describing this stretch of the march record that men of low caste, their rations exhausted, were reduced to subsisting on the flesh of dead buffalo. Now consider the scene, and doesn't take much to realize that what was waiting for them on top of all of this was disease. Smallpox broke out among the soldiers, and the camp followers trailing behind the column. Now, these followers were not combatants, but the ones who supplied food and resources. A marching camp, packed tightly and moving slowly, is exactly the kind of place that disease spreads the fastest. The camp followers in particular bore the worst of it: the cooks, the grooms, the bullock drivers, the families who trailed every 18th century army and who had no rations reserved, no medical attention, and no say in when the march would stop. Now, to add to the woes, that year the monsoons arrived weeks ahead of schedule, and it drenched the British army for days on end. Worse, turning what dry ground remained into the very slush that Cornwallis had been racing to avoid. On 24th May 1791, Charles Cornwallis sat down and wrote a private letter to Charles Oakley, a senior official of the Madras Presidency. He described the condition of his force, and the letter is not the confident dispatch of a general closing in on his objective. It is the frank, sober account of a man in real logistical trouble, a commander who could see with some clarity where all of this was headed, i.e., nowhere. On 14th March 1791, just 10 days before that letter, the British column had reached the village of Arakere, roughly 20 kilometers from Srirangapatna. Tipu's forces came out to meet them, and the fighting that followed was serious. This was not exactly just a British engagement. Let's remember that the Nizam of Hyderabad's contingent was now marching as part of the coalition, standing alongside the British troops in this line. Mysore's cavalry was consistently faster and more aggressive than anything that the Allies could field. It pressed hard against the flank of the column, attacking laterally, probing for any gap in the formation. But the combined artillery held the center, guns firing in volleys that filled the field, completely with smoke and noise, and the infantry kept formations under sustained pressure, refusing to be drawn out of line, no matter how hard Tipu's forces tried. By the end of the day, Tipu's forces had withdrawn back inside the walls of Srirangapatna. On paper, Cornwallis had held the field. It looked from a distance like a victory, and this was the coalition's first real test in open battle, and it passed without breaking. But it was not enough. A quick reconnaissance of Srirangapatna's fortifications confirmed what Cornwallis had always feared, that his army in its present state could achieve nothing of consequence against those thick walls. Besides, the forces in the British coalition were exhausted. Short of buffaloes, it was short of food, it had been battered by weeks of disease and unseasonal rain. Every soldier had marched to within sights of the capital of Mysore, and none of it mattered now, because the army no longer held the strength left to finish what it had started. Cornwallis faced the single most demoralizing decision available to any general in the field: retreat. On 24th May 1791, the same day that he had written to Oakley, he gave the order. Equipment too heavy to carry was abandoned where it stood. The great siege cannon, the guns that had marched all the way specifically to breach the walls of Srirangapatna, hauled at such cost by exhausted men in the place of dead bullocks, were blown apart. These cannons had to be destroyed, standard practice, so Tipu could never turn them against the former owners. Likewise, dry ammunition went into the river Kaveri rather than into Tipu's arsenal. And then the British column turned around and began the long walk back to Bangalore. Not defeated in battle, but defeated all the same, by hunger, by disease, and by a scorched and flooded road that had turned to slush beneath their feet. Cornwallis walked back through the mud. 2 months of preparation, a circuitous march designed to avoid every trap that Tipu had laid, a hard-fought stand at Arakere, and at the end of it, nothing to show but an army in retreat and a season already slipping away. It is worth pausing on what that retreat might have felt like from the inside. This was a commander who had marched out of Bangalore with the weight of London's impatience on one shoulder and the coming monsoon on the other, a man who had outmaneuvered Tipu on the approach to Srirangapatna, had held his own in the only pitched battle of this campaign, and come within sight of the walls of the Mysore capital, only to be turned back, not by Tipu's army, but by empty granaries, collapsing bullocks, and, very simply, rain. Srirangapatna remained exactly where it had been, untaken, unbroken, and for the moment entirely safe. Whatever London made of this delay, whatever the monsoon had cost Cornwallis in the weeks ahead, Cornwallis would have to find a way to try again. All that is coming up in the next episode. Keep your eyes peeled. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.